Hello, everyone. So, this semester, we're going to be working on how to develop good scientific writing. And as part of that, I'm going to be doing a short series of videos talking about the highlights of the do's and don'ts of good scientific writing. So, today, we're going to be giving a general overview of what's kind of expected of scientific papers in general instead of in the individual sections. So, the first thing that is really important to understand is what we're talking about when we're talking about scientific writing. So, there's three major types of scientific papers you're likely to encounter. So, the first of which is the communication. So these have become of increasing importance in the modern world of everything needs to be out there right away. And the communications are essentially oriented at high priority results. So if you have a groundbreaking finding or an important piece of data that the world needs to know about as soon as possible, the communication is generally the way that you go. So the communications are essentially just supposed to be focusing in on one or two key results that you found that have essentially direct and rapid impact. So they're much more of limited scope. They often have a shorter page limit. They're frequently anywhere from 2 to 6 pages, and very rarely more than that. And they often defocus on the experimental details and essentially instead move their focus to the primary results. And a lot of the extra experimental details that you might need to replicate the work is essentially moved to any sort of supplemental information where you can, where only those who are really interested in it are really going to go ahead and look for it. But the real bread and butter of scientific papers is the article. So this is essentially the major method of communicating new research findings. So if you have essentially new research that the world needs to know, you're usually going to be publishing an article. Now, these tend to have much more variety in their length and format and style. Uh, Articles are going to be much broader in perspective, either uh, typically constituting either one general experiment or sometimes several experiments that have been done together to generate a whole new story. And the exact length can typically go anywhere from, say, 4 pages to 60. And the exact format and length is usually going to be dependent upon what type of research is being done. Certain types of research require a more in-depth perspective, and also the journal. Some journals have very strict page limits because they want to put as many papers in as possible. And some journals are designed for communicating big, in-depth stories. And so thus they may publish fewer articles, but of much longer length. But generally, if you're going to be presenting research, you're usually going to go about it through presenting a general article. However, it is worth acknowledging there is a third type of very common scientific paper, and these are reviews. So, reviews are essentially a paper that's going to go ahead and tie together the results in a whole bunch of articles and communications and give a general overview of where the field of study is right now. And oftentimes these have very little new results, though occasionally you're going to find a review article, which essentially is trying to tie together a series of results that have been in previous articles, and then does a short meta study, essentially putting all of these analyses next to each other with some very limited new information about how the various new methods or findings stack up against each other. However, where reviews are really excel is when trying to keep on top of the rapidly developing literature. So one of the big things with reviews is that if you're looking at a new area of science, generally there's going to be a major review article published about every 5 to 10 years. So if you want to know where the state of the art is, go ahead and try and hunt down a good review article. And often, if there's more rapid progress in the scientific field, you're going to see many more review articles, which will help get you up to pace. That said, because what we often care about when we're citing articles is the actual information, try and avoid citing review articles and instead go to where the actual data came from, so the communications and the articles. And in general, the place that you're often going to use a review article is if you need to gain familiarity, and then you can go ahead and analyze its citations to figure out where the data originally came from to hunt down the original articles and communications. So we're going to be focusing a little bit more on how to write a good scientific article, but a lot of our lessons are going to hold to communications. Reviews are kind of their own beast, so we're going to essentially neglect them in our discussion of scientific writing for now. So if I'm going to go ahead and write a scientific article, we're often splitting this article into 5 major parts. The first of which is essentially the abstract. So this almost stands outside of the general paper format, but the abstract itself is essentially going to be a short, usually single paragraph synopsis of all the work completed in the paper. So a good way to think about the abstract is this is going to be the paper in miniature. It's going to have essentially an introduction, a sentence of introduction, a sentence synopsis, summarizing your methods, usually several sentences summarizing your results and discussion. However, we often try and essentially avoid restating what was in the introductions, methods, results, and discussion, and instead condensing it into a small digestible chunk that gives you an idea of what's there in as short a form as possible. And this brings us to the actual main part of the paper, which starts off with the introduction. So the introduction is going to essentially give us a brief background into what questions are being asked and generally why should I care about the research being done. Then from there, once I know why I should care and what I should care about, then we're going to go into the experimental methods. So these are going to be a lot more specific to exactly what's being done, and they're going to essentially give us enough information so that I can replicate whatever work was done in the paper. And this is essentially the gold standard for what should be in the methods section, is enough to replicate their general results. Then, now that I know how they got the results, let's go ahead and you're going to go ahead and present a general summary of what results you found and essentially what they mean. Now, at this point, you've kind of gone deep into the details of the system. So what you often need to do is usually towards the end of your discussion, but into your essentially summary and conclusions, now you need to essentially back out and make a connection to the greater world that you originally started with your introductions. So once we get to summary and conclusions, you're going to quickly summarize what your findings were, but often much more important is why they matter and what are going to be their kind of implications. So this is essentially kind of the general structure of the paper. And in general, it's actually fairly common to write your experimental methods section first because you often know exactly what you did. And from there, you're often going to either write your introduction or your results. Introduction, so you have a good general perspective of what the bigger questions are that you're trying to answer, and then you can start tying those in with your discussion, but also your results to make sure you know what you found. And then after that, you usually write your summary section to essentially know what happened. And the last thing you typically write is going to be your abstract, because again, it's the paper in miniature. So you often need to know exactly what the rest of the paper says. However, when we're actually going to be writing these sections, there's a couple of important details that differ from a typical English or English or creative writing sort of paper and what we expect in scientific writing. And so some of the key important differences is that in general, our scientific papers are going to be typically written in the present tense. Because when we're doing scientific papers, we're talking a lot about facts. And so what is true? And that's the reason why we are typically using the present tense. Something either is true or it isn't true. And so by using the present tense, we keep the reader grounded in this general sense of facts. And so often you may say be reviewing the literature. This is going to essentially take the form of saying, all right, this paper found this. And not so much saying that they found it, but more focusing in on this is what was found, this is what is true. And we're going to try and make this form of stating of facts, and the process is more just uncovering them. However, past tense does have its purpose, and this is going to essentially be to emphasize specific things that were done. And so there's going to be a bit of that when reviewing the literature of saying who did what, but most of the time, the past tense is going to be mostly localized in the methods section when you're going to essentially just say what you did. But there is a lot of leniency in between essentially the present and the past tense. But the most important thing to make sure you do is make sure that your tense, that when you're are writing a single sentence, that all of your tenses within that sentence agree. So try and not avoid moving back and forth in between past and present tense. And in general, even within a paragraph, you're going to want to try and keep the whole paragraph within a single tense. But there's also the matter of voice. So typically when you're writing for, say, an English professor, they're going to be emphasizing that you use the active voice. And one of the reasons why is because the active voice is a very dynamic voice. It's very compelling. But the active voice often emphasizes that somebody is doing something. In general, we tend to avoid the use of active voice in chemistry because we want things to be true regardless of who did them. Now, the active voice is a lot more popular in some subdisciplines and some other subjects such as biology. But in chemistry, we're typically going to go towards the present voice. And we're going to try and reserve our active voice for situations where the person who accomplished who accomplished something actually matters. So I might use the active voice when talking about Professor X discovered Y. But again, this typically only matters when we care about who did something. Another common example is when you have something that you want to emphasize was your work and not somebody else's. And this can often be found in, say, the conclusions or the end of the discussions where you're trying to summarize what you found in this work. However, while I do tend to discourage the use of active voice within a paper, I do highly encourage the use of active past tense when you're writing your notebooks. Because in your notebooks, it's very important to note when you did something and when your partner did something. And in general, because it's a notebook, you almost should always be putting things in the past tense because things were done. If things are to be done, I can't be sure that you actually did it and not just that you intended to. However, a lot of times we're going to go towards the passive voice because in chemistry, it's often unimportant who did the action. We're trying to convey facts. So when I'm trying to emphasize that I'm dealing with impartial facts, then we're going to try and keep to this use of the passive voice. And this can often be the case when, say, you're writing your procedure for your paper, where you're going to essentially give a list of actions of saying the solution was shaken. Does it matter who shook the solution? Not so much. And so these are going to be some of the general trends in writing that you should be aware of when writing scientific papers. We tend to emphasize the present passive voice a little bit more than some other disciplines, and it is important to kind of be aware for that. So next time, we're going to dive in a little bit more into how to write a good introduction section. Till then, take care.